okay, well, what do I want to do? So I'm still moving towards my goals, but I'm doing what I feel most excited about in that moment, which means I'm going to be more
Yeah.
productive, more successful, and it's not going to take as long. When I actually looked at why did they drink, it tended to be more socially sort of acceptable, particularly in New Zealand. I assume Australian culture is very similar, like drinking's quite predominant. And then also confidence. And when I took the alcohol out, it was a real opportunity to go, oh, wow, I feel quite self-conscious going and dancing
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
like stretching that muscle. And now I almost feel like I don't need it for that crutch. And therefore, I don't have the same fallout the next day, which is wonderful. The brain injury still gives me its own kind of hangover in a sense.
Yeah.
But now I'm confident enough to be that first person on the dance floor at the wedding. And it's not that security blanket that I had previously.
So I'm here with Taya, and we actually met through a business accelerator course. And yeah, I've been wanting to connect with you for a while because I remember you were telling me, or you were telling the group about your journey, and it was hitting a few points with me, and I was like, oh, actually, yeah, there's some things I'd love to jam on, and we've finally been able to do it, like much later. So, did you want to just introduce yourself, Taya? Maybe like a little bit of like where you've come from and like where you're at now, and be as short or as long as you want with that.
Yeah, definitely. But it's awesome to finally actually make this happen because it's been a little while in the making. But as Jessa said, I'm Thea. So I'm based in New Zealand, and my background career-wise is actually in agriculture. And then how we met was doing a sort of business accelerator course for me. My focus was brain injury and coaching in that space, which is quite different to agriculture. But what led me there is experiencing a few concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries myself, some milder than others. But it really sort of opened up a new avenue that, in all honesty, I didn't see my life going down. But as twists and turns of life go, it's been quite a beautiful road and quite a beautiful journey. So I experienced 2 as a child, which didn't really notice too much impact, and then 4 as an adult between 2018 and 2020. And
Mm.
then, yeah, I've just kind of been exploring since then.
Yeah, and some of them left you pretty rocked, right?
Yeah,
Like there was quite a severe impact they had on you.
definitely, definitely. So the ones as an adult, which are the 4 that I tend to talk about, because they're the ones that I feel really sort of impacted me and my path. But the first of those took about 3 months to get back to full-time work. That was a horse riding incident. The 2 in
Mm.
between were sort of not too major, they were a couple of weeks, and then I was able to be back to baseline. And then the 4th one, which was from some skydiving, the parachute came out a bit incorrectly. There was some really good decent whiplash, but I landed fine. That one really, really shook the system.
Yeah.
And what are we now? Just over 2 years on, and there's still aspects of it that I manage in my day to day.
Mm.
So that was really like the kicker that prompted a lot of change and a lot of sort of assessment in my own life.
And it's quite interesting, isn't it, how much you need to adapt to your new level of being when you go through that, because it's so fascinating how the biology, we have creates this sense of self.
Mm.
And just recently, a few weeks ago, which actually was what prompted me to reach out to you, I was doing breath work at my computer, went for a breath hold, lost consciousness, hit the ground quite
Yes.
heavily, hit my head like to the point that it actually jarred the neck, but also bruised. It was like right on the side of the head. And like I got up immediately feeling a bit tired, laid down, lay that day nauseous, and had a pretty quick impact on my cognition. And what's really interesting is I've invested very heavily in self-work, acceptance of self, all
Mm.
of these things that, are quite important to living like a life that's balanced. But as soon as the biology was affected, I immediately felt a decrease in mood. I felt like there was a bit of like, like sadness that had come up. I felt like over the next week, like I'm not doing what I normally can. I'm not as articulate. I'm not operating at that level. I've come to know myself. And that requires a whole acceptance journey to be like, okay, this is how I normally identify myself, and I'm operating here. And yeah, like I've
Totally.
had a few head injuries myself. And it wasn't even until I heard your story originally that I was like, yeah, I've really been downplaying that, because when I was about 5 or 6, I ran headfirst into a door frame at full run,
Wow.
hit the top of my head, kind of got up, and later that night I was throwing up bile. And so that's like probably a pretty severe concussion.
Mm.
And at the time, the person's house I was at, they were like, oh, it's probably because you're in a new environment, and like chalked it up to like a psycho-emotional thing. But later on in retrospect, I was like, oh, that's actually a concussion. And it was
Mm.
about that time I went from being able to remember, let's say at 4 years old, the months of the year, and then at that point, not remembering the months of the year. And, at the time, it wasn't identified, but looking back, I was like, oh, that could have been why. And then,
Yeah.
like, my learning difficulties, like, I was never like really struggling, but it would have definitely had an impact. And then later on, probably in the last 10 years, I've probably had about at least another 3 noteworthy concussions, and where I could feel severe cognitive decline from that. And would you say, like, with each time you've brain's had a trauma, it's a little bit more sensitive the next times?
I've found each like each person is unique. I found each brain injury, at least for me, has been quite unique. And
Mm,
this is also where I think, and like hearing your story here, I think it's so important that we have these conversations, because they are so common to experience concussions in particular, but because of the invisible nature of them, it's not quite like a broken leg. We can't see that someone's really limping or that it's bleeding visibly.
yeah.
That it's really easy to sort of brush off and not understand. And also remembering that the brain controls, like, it's how we experience life. It controls
Mm,
movement, emotion, sensation, all of our sort of organs, what they're doing. So when you injure your brain, there can be so many different factors that are impacted depending on, what the impact was, whereabouts you had the trauma, your history
yeah.
of prior traumas. And so for me personally, each one has been slightly unique, but
Yeah.
definitely one that I find progressively I've noticed more post concussion is memory.
Mm,
And that's actually how I knew the third one I had as an adult. I was like, oh, okay, maybe there's something going on here, because someone that I knew actually quite well came up to me and I had no idea who they were, and they were like,
mm,
oh, hey Taya, from our conversation on Wednesday, could we do this? That was only 2 days ago, and I had to like just nod along, took notes, and go and ask someone like, hey, who is that? Um,
yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's one that I
That's
have noticed has been more consistently. Everything else has been like a little bit of almost like a buffet style. Like sometimes there's a little
mm,
bit of, I don't know, maybe more fatigue, more headaches, more frustration. But yeah, it's a really challenging journey, and it doesn't come with a rule book, which I think, or I personally find hard. So like you're sort of saying, accepting and adjusting to where those new levels are,
yeah.
that process can be really challenging when you don't
Mm,
necessarily know where those boundaries are. So there's a certain amount of trial and error and experimentation and grief and loss that comes with establishing what that actually looks like for you in your journey.
yeah. Very true. Yeah, I resonate with that, because I
Mm.
think the brain, or the cognitive impact for me, was a part of it, but I think I experienced a lot of symptoms physically from
Mm.
heavy metal toxicity over the years, and like just a slate of like so many things that can impact one's ability and function, like mold injury and head trauma and heavy metal stuff, and then like party life that doesn't help that at all. And basically, yeah, I went through a similar journey of like, when you're used to being able to do this much exercise, this much activity in a day, you've got like quite the bandwidth of a normal person or more. And then you have these things that impact you, and you start to realize, oh, I can't do what everyone else is doing. Oh, I can't do what I used to do. Oh, and yeah, such a
Yeah.
difficult journey to readjust to that, because especially like you're saying, when you can't necessarily see these things, that makes people less understanding of it, but also yourself. Like, it's not like you can be like, oh, I've got a broken arm, it's going to take 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes, like, I wouldn't have been aware because my concussions weren't that severe, like, I wouldn't have expected there'd be any reduced function or performance from it. So I was just questioning, like, oh, why can't I do this? Like, and that can take a bit for you to, like, like you said, explore, oh, here's my new energy bandwidth. And then over time, see the repercussions of exceeding it. And eventually you learn not to exceed it. But yeah, determining where that line is, that's such a painful trial and error.
And also, like you're sort of touching on, actually identifying that, oh, maybe there is a deficit, because once you know there's a deficit or what area there's challenges, personally I prefer that, because then I can start wrapping support around it. But if I don't know where to sort of put my focus or energy, I find that really frustrating. And the first one I had as an adult, so it was a Saturday with the horse incident, and I think it was Thursday at work that, the manager walked in and said, how are you? And I was like, I'm okay. No, like, how are you? And I just broke down into tears. And up until that point, people have been talking to me. I didn't understand what they were saying. I was speaking really incoherently. My memory was all off. I felt really kind of slowed down and walking through mud. But it was all these odd symptoms that I didn't know what that experience was, because I didn't remember experiencing it. And it was because luckily he coached rugby. So he kind of was able to look, and he said, look, you're not staying at work today. I'm calling your boss. We're taking you to the hospital, and you're seeing this person, and it's not a discussion. And I'm really grateful to them that they actually did that, because I was just trying to stubbornly push through, kind of like you would a cold, like, it'll be 3 days, push through, she'll be right. And then that enabled me to start opening up and understanding a little bit more. And the subsequent concussions were a bit easier in the sense that I could better identify what was happening. But it is so hard if you or your caregivers or people in your support crew just don't understand quite the extent of areas of life that a concussion can impact.
Yeah, 100%. Because then they're still expecting the same output as you had previously.
Yeah.
But if your ability has now reduced to here, it's so damaging, in my experience, when you try and operate at that previous level. Because what seems to happen, if, previously you could operate here, but now that's like you're here, so this is 120% effort. That just causes your energy envelope and your mental bandwidth to reduce perpetually until you get to such a small level of functionality where, like, just daily chores are a struggle. And like you said, moving through mud is, I think, a very apt way to describe the feeling, because it's like this strong brain fog where it's like there's a cloud over your mind, and trying to reach into your mind to get a formed thought is not accessible. And so there's like little bits coming through, and it's so hard to actually, like, coherently structure what you're trying to say. And then you're simultaneously feeling like everything's like an 8 out of 10 effort.
It's such a mission, and it's such a surreal experience. It's really hard to explain to people that haven't necessarily experienced that before, but I kind of almost felt like I was in a movie that I hadn't been told that I was in. Like, I'm trying to work out what the script is and what the plot line is, because my brain isn't processing information in the same way. And it's a really intriguing one. And then I found, at least in my journey, there's kind of that, okay, acknowledging that there was challenges and there was impact, trying to work out what that was in that moment, and then going through that process of grieving, like you say, like something you might have previously done quite easily. Maybe that's not where you're at the moment, and learning how to switch from, rather than comparing to where I was, but looking forward to where I am today and where I'm wanting to go, because it's like a much healthier space to be in. It's much more positive for me personally to be sitting in that space. But, it's also managing that there are times or moments where that grief or loss will come up.
And exactly. To not spiritually bypass it, or, like, psychologically bypass it and be like, no, I shouldn't, I just got to face forward. At the same time, accepting what comes up, but also orientating your focus to where you are now and where you want to be. There's a lot of
or not
Sorry,
to you.
go
I
on.
was going to say it's like you say, it's holding that space and learning. There's so much learning. Like this is where I do say, even though the brain injuries have been such a curveball in my life, it has genuinely been such a gift because of the skills I have had to learn to manage and step through. I think really benefits me as I continue to go on in life. And one in particular is that holding space for the emotions, because it is important that we acknowledge them and like honor our body with whatever space is needed in that moment, and then focusing with that gratitude and focusing on the wins and the little steps, because it's that one step in front of the other that continues to build. And so learning how to like balance those has been quite an unexpected gift of the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, and that's pretty much exactly what I was going to touch on, the gift that it can be, the life lessons. And like in my own health journey, I've found what it's taken to manage the effects that my previous lifestyle and events has had on me. I've really up leveled my health and health habits. And so one of the things that was almost like training at 100 times weight, I had 3 amalgam fillings in my mouth that seemed to be having a bit of a mercury load on the body, and that can cause neurological and biological, physiological rather, effects. So like, like fatigue, etc. And when I had them removed, it really like improved my health. But because I was trying to just maintain despite this onslaught of heavy metal toxicity, eating improved. Like I would prioritize sleep, doing meditation, looking into some supplementation, like I said to you previously, biohacking, and I can define my own term of what that means in a bit. But yeah, like and really like, it comes back to the basics of like sleeping, recovering, eating, nutrition, and, not exceeding the energy capacity you have, but also not doing nothing and regressing, but managing to like, gently expand yourself without burning out and breaking yourself.
Yeah, which is so important in life in general. And I think often, at least in my own road, that's not something I've previously prioritized, because I have been able to get away with not prioritizing it. I've been able to get away with like burning the candle at both ends and just pushing through, but this actually forced me to go, oh shivers, I've got one body for my whole life. Like it's pretty special. I really want to look after it. I really want to support it. And putting the focus on that is not a negative thing.
No, and I think that particular experience causes you to put the focus on it to such a high degree that it becomes a priority above all else. And it almost teaches you how to serve yourself first before others, because you can see like you just need to put all focus on your own healing. And it can be, like at one point when you switch to that feels selfish, but then later on you realize you have to do that to show up fully for others.
And do you kind of feel in your own road like that's the destination you've reached, or that's always a growth and a progress?
I think it's a work in progress, because what seems to happen for me is I get out of a deficit feeling of, like the brain fog, the fatigue symptoms, and I get, back to a state of normality, still have, potential to get into, but then that old, putting 100% effort in, prioritizing some other stuff seems to want to, take my focus. And as soon as I take my focus from myself being a priority, my energy gets down, and then I'm like, oh, now I'm back here and now I've got to prioritize myself. I will say though, each time I'm, keeping food locked in, sleep is mostly prioritized, but it's probably one of the things that does go to the wayside at times. But yeah, overall, like from 10 years ago, I've got a pretty good level of prioritizing the self, but I still feel like I could improve.
Cool. Yeah, I kind of how you worded that is, I very much resonate. To me, it's not linear, but the progression is like upwards and improving.
Yeah,
and like
exactly.
you say, sort of when I get to quite a sweet spot, that's where I can have a tendency to get all excited and go boom bust and realize, oh, but then being able to pull those levers quickly to support or identify much earlier, that's starting to be a bit of a cycle.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. The cycle may continue, but you start to have more awareness of the consequences from the actions earlier. And then eventually I theorize, you'll get to a point where you can see yourself about to make the
Yeah.
action that will lead to a consequence and stop it before it happens. I've done that in other areas of life, but not necessarily the physical.
But it's always a road, which is pretty cool, I kind of feel, like
Yeah,
that there's always something to do and to learn and to grow in, because we have quite a few years on this earth, which is pretty
yeah,
special. So being able to kind of level up in different areas as we go through is very cool.
100%. I was going to say as well, like as you were saying that, um, it occurred to me most people have the experience of burning the candle at both ends, not living at optimal practices for health. And it's not until like 40, 50, 60 that the consequences of that become evident. But by that time, their habits are so ingrained in their neural pathways that it's so hard to change unless they have something so dramatic like cancer for them to have like the motivation to actually change what they're doing. I think in some ways you and I are fortunate that we've had such dramatic things early on, while we still have quite good like neuroplasticity and adaptability in the body, that now we've got our health habits optimized. Although we had like quite strong effects on the body early on, now, we can have 30, 40 years to continue down a deepening path of health.
Totally. And kind of an example of that, of like habit or approach, is I'm currently doing my master's in speech and language pathology. Missed that out of my intro. Whoops. But that's as a
That's
result
right.
of brain injuries and just being really curious about the brains and wanting to help other people in that path, and community is really important. So that's why I'm studying that. But because of my own brain injury journey, I was unable to study it full time. Which my mentality was, well, they're never going to accept me. What's the point of doing it if it's not 100%? But then I had to realize my body wasn't physically there. And so I'm doing it part-time, which I never would have considered at all. But honestly, it's been so cool, because as my recovery continues to improve with the brain injury, and as I continue to get better with each little thing, I get more space and more capacity to do what I want to do and to enjoy. And so it's meant that whilst I'm still studying, I'm working towards that big picture of working and being able to impact the medical field in this brain injury space. I'm also able to learn content creation and, connect with people in that community and create an impact online and networks online. And if I was actually doing this full time, I don't think I would have had the bandwidth, no brain injury or not, to be able to do all these extra things, which have really become such a part of me. Like we wouldn't know each other if it was full
No.
time.
Yeah. And I think it's really balanced to have the approach that you have, where you're creating the content to get your own journey and message and new knowledge and like ability to frame it out to the people that need it while you're doing the study. Like, I feel like to me that makes a lot more sense, because you're already connected with the community rather than just like doing the study and now having to try and do that later on.
Yeah, right. And it also fuels my why. I'm going to be honest, like academic written stuff is not my passion point. But the big picture is why I'm here. So it's really nice having that creative outlet and connecting with people that are really passionate about very important, worthwhile topics and doing something creative. It just continues to fuel my why of why I'm spending hours during my week doing written assignments and reading research papers and things like that, which don't come as naturally to me. I really have to sit down and sort of discipline myself to put the time in.
I could so much kudos goes to you for doing it, because I'm doing a Cert 3 and 4 at the moment in fitness here in Australia, and they've crammed it into 14 weeks for both certificates. And it occurred to me as you were speaking about the part-time, I'm like, yeah, that would have been the logical way, because I think something I've realized is, let's say whatever it is, whether it's exercise, business success, study, you can go, oh, what is required of success is to study full-time and do this, and I'm going to do it for 14 weeks and go flat out. But sometimes what's required for success and what your current best ability is aren't the same. And if you're just going to try and do that and adapt, if you're near it, you can do that. But if you're way off, it's going to break you. And yeah, when I hit my head a couple of weeks ago, I was already at a high level of resistance and it definitely, I just had to go, okay, I've got to take a step back. I'm going to do what's the basic things needed to move forward. But now I've got this backlog of about 4 weeks. So that's, it is what it is. Just have to
Good luck.
accept that. It wasn't going to be worth just like absolutely exceeding and like pushing myself mentally when I wasn't able to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the way you described it, doing part-time so you can do what's within your capacity. And then as you become more comfortable with that and have more space open, you can increase the amount of time and energy you're putting into it, which is going to be a far more linear way than just trying to go and adapt or break.
Yeah. But I think as well, kind of what you were saying, it's almost the expected way or the typical route is to be like all or nothing.
Yeah.
And what I sort of learned in my brain injury road, I knew this anyway, but it really highlighted, I love variety. And so the all or nothing, mind you, if I find something I'm really passionate about, I will sit there for hours if my body will allow me. But what I really like about the part-time is I have time for social connection. I have time for overseas trips. I have time for further learning in other areas I'm interested in. So I can kind of fill my other cups as well. Whereas I look at peers around me, and curiously, actually, quite a few have shifted to part-time, because I'd always walk in with a big smile on my face, particularly on Fridays, and I'd go, "Good morning." And people would be like, hair wouldn't be brushed. People would be close to the brink of tears because it was just so much, and they didn't have the capacity to go and spend that time with friends or go for that walk on the beach. And that's actually really important for well-being, to be able to show up fully.
100%. Yeah, look, I must admit, I'm very much all or nothing, doing FIFO work for 6 months and then like taking 8 months off to focus on like the coaching journey. And then I like you, if I become obsessive about something, I go deep into it. But I've also found I've almost created this pattern within myself where I can maybe have like 7 to 10 weeks of being strongly focused on something. And then like say this PT study, and then it's kind of shifted over into wanting to do the coaching stuff. And I'm trying to not get shiny object syndrome. But then at the same time, there's also this feeling of like, when your highest purpose is calling you, and then it's like I have to kind of keep bringing focus back to the PT study. And now it's at this point where it's so not motivating, because like I ran a retreat a couple of weeks ago, and like it was like, when you're doing something, it just gives you so much fulfillment. I actually didn't charge for it. I gave a ticket away, and so I was out of pocket for it. But it was so fulfilling that I was left in such a state of abundance after it, because I knew that that's what I really wanted to do. And when you get that sense of like fulfillment because you're on the path that you want to be on, then I go back to PT study and I'm like, like this isn't. So yeah, it's taken a bit of effort to kind of remain present there and get things done. But I want to, actually see things out, because in the past I've tried to do art, and then I've got like, that pattern's played out, and I've got like 20 half-started pieces of art. I'm like, no, I've got to complete things.
I think as well, acknowledging, because I'm such a magpie, particularly post-brain injury. Like I want to make the most of the opportunities available. Sometimes I put too much in my basket at one point. And also the fully diving into things, and then I get a little bit bored, and then I want to go and do something else. But sort of how I started to look at it is we're still accumulating skills that can flow into other future projects. And, if that's sort of the ebb and flow, learning to embrace. So I've learned I seem to get less burnt out when I have a couple of things that I can move. So generally I'm a bit seasonal. So these coming 2 weeks are masters work. I've got heaps on. But then the next 5 weeks after that will get to be content creation. I'm not even think about masters work. So I get to kind of mix and match a little bit. So it's not like every day's even, but probably over 6 months, it's quite even between all the things I like to do.
I see. That's seeming like, a solution that I would require. That would be quite interesting if what you and I just described is a theme that comes with any like brain injury type things that, and to me, like I definitely have like oscillated between quite a few focuses, but they do circle back. And then each time I go a little bit deeper down them. It's not quite the linear path that typical society takes and gets to a deep level of progression. But I guess you know, like for me, I'm going through content creation, bit of study, working away and doing like self-work type growth things. But each time I go back to each of them, I get a bit further down. So like you said, they all flow into one another.
Totally. And I think as well, I know for me, because I can deep dive and then want to go and do something else that looks shiny. So I really thrive with accountability, which is where I do invest in coaching programs, and I do invest in kind of group community things, because it accelerates my learning, because it keeps me accountable. So, I have a group of content creator mates, and I'm held accountable for what I've said of how much I'm going to post, which means that I'm regularly getting that practice in. But if I didn't have that community kind of messaging and being like, looking forward to your video tomorrow, I probably wouldn't do it as consistently. Or like with the gym, I hire a PT once a week, because by seeing him once a week, I then go at least one other time a week.
Yeah.
But if I don't have a PT, I end up not going, and my body ends up getting injured more often because I'm not strengthening it. So it's kind of like, I guess, working out how everyone's motivated. But some people can innately follow this, and that's really cool for them. But I just acknowledge that my brain works a little bit more differently.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of it, aside from like the neurological pathways being affected by a brain injury, but you were living life like this, and then you had a severe event that put you on a different path. Like, so you're going there now, you're different path. How much that's like a macro pattern that's playing out in the micro, where you want to keep doing something else because you're so used to this massive energetic imprint on your energy that was like shift patterns, shift paths.
Yeah. And I think as well, previously I would see something and be like, oh no, I can't do that because this is what I'm doing, or this is, I need to do this, I'm obligated to do this. Whereas now I tend to go, look, today's a great day, my body's feeling great, this is an opportunity. If I can make it work, I'm going to make it work. So that people sometimes ask how I travel with masters, but it's just kind of moving to try and make things work in, because that's what's important to me. But historically, I would have just said, whilst I'm doing my masters, I can't travel because I don't have to, But I think it's that more like having a zest for wanting to pick up the opportunities that come.
Yeah. And I think that's the challenge I've been finding, that to be successful in, say, exercise or content creation, consistency is a key factor.
Yeah.
And that's something that challenges someone like yourself or I, that have that shiny object syndrome draw, like pull towards, and then you need to just maintain some level of consistency, because stopping and starting with content creation doesn't work. With exercise, it's not great. So yeah, just trying to stay on the ladder and continue at, like, even if it's 1% a week, whatever, a month, it'll compound.
Definitely. And kind of thinking I'll have like a to-do list, and if there's something I'm really not looking to, then I've learned to, rather than forcing myself to do that one thing and taking 3 times longer, then I'll look at my list and go, okay, well, what do I want to do? So I'm still moving towards my goals, but I'm doing what I feel most excited about in that moment, which means I'm going to be more productive, more successful, and it's not going to take as long. So just learning how to shift focus has been really powerful for me. I don't think that's necessarily a brain injury thing. I think it's just better understanding how I tend to think and process things, even pre-brain injury, and then using it to my strength.
Beautiful. Just being conscious of the time. Do you have time to talk about more, or are you like on a schedule today?
I've got about 15 minutes. Happy to jam a bit longer.
Okay. I don't want to take up time that you had reserved for space between the next thing, though.
No, 15 minutes is good, and then I'll need but
cool,
I'm loving the flow of this chat.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I thought it could be cool to kind of talk about like a little bit of like the strategies that go into the recovery. So like, rest, the acceptance piece, working within the new energy bandwidth, like, and then maybe like talking a little bit about what I said before, biohacking. So to me, biohacking, my definition, because everyone has their own, is creating awareness of the mechanisms of action. So like understanding what underlying mechanisms within the body can be manipulated for better health outcomes. So it could be something simple like trying to activate the parasympathetic nervous system and decrease sympathetic activation, or getting a little bit more granular, looking at reducing oxidative stress and inflammation throughout the body, or getting even further into the weeds and looking at increasing something like brain-derived neurotropic factor, BDNF, to improve brain health. And you can do that through like exercise, supplementation, etc. So yeah, basically that's what biohacking is to me, understanding what those underlying mechanisms are so you can have a targeted approach to create better outcomes for one's health and well-being.
Cool. Thank you for the definition of that. Because for anyone listening, I said to Jezza, I was like, I've never really heard this term before. What does it mean? But as you were talking, there's really cool stuff in there. So it's sort of essentially really understanding the functionalities of the body and how everything's entwined, and then how we can best support that for the outcome we're looking for.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And then that typically lends to, you can get myopic with it, but typically, everything comes back to holistic health. The gut affects the brain, etc., vice versa. And yeah, so for me, because I think, you can go biohacking really like into an unhealthy way at times, but as long as you keep the holistic kind of intention there and you cover the base level things of, diet, nutrition, and, exercise, social life, the things that contribute to a holistic life, and then add some biohacking. Once you've done the basic things, then that could be quite beneficial. The problem is, like, with supplementation, people do it that, don't eat a good diet and try and make up for it with supplements. That's not supplementary, that's going primary. And yeah, so I just wanted to kind of put that caveat to healthy biohacking.
Cool. That's a nice one to emphasize, I think.
You've
got to have that strong foundation. I guess it's like having that strong foundation before you then start decorating a house or
exactly
sparkly things on. So like your diet is really foundational versus trying to compensate that.
Did you find a particular diet was beneficial? Did you try?
Yeah, so I and I'm always conscious when talking about diets that each person is very individual.
100%.
And so the first 3 brain injuries, I didn't change anything with diet, but the 4th one, it was at a point where I was essentially looking at needing to step back from my career because of where my body was physically at. And I'd essentially been in a dark room in pain for sort of like 3 months for the most part, doing what I could outside of that. So I was ready to just do what I could to best support. And I think Dr. Cam Marshall is the name. He's got a course called wow, my brain, it's the concussion something, I don't want to say the wrong one. Anyway, Dr. Cam Marshall. So they have kind of like different professionals on board, and they had a diet in there which essentially was eliminating anything that could be inflammatory, and then doing that for, I think it was 4 or 6 weeks, I can't quite remember, and then gradually introducing one thing at a time. And it was the easiest diet I've ever done, in the sense that I was so motivated to support my body to move from where it was. So it was really interesting seeing that like motivator, because I wanted to go out for coffee with friends, and I wanted to be able to drive 3-hour road trip, and I couldn't even drive 10 minutes at this stage. So I was so motivated. And it was about maybe like 4 or 6 months in total. And sort of what came out for my body was caffeine. So I don't have caffeine. Gluten was one, refined sugar. But I also quite like things with sugar. So I tend to have it in moderation. Whereas I find gluten, I react more so. And then alcohol was also one that I stopped. So those were sort of the ones that mainly came out for me that I find most supportive.
Alcohol is a massive one. I've found it's probably been coming up 4 years that I've really cut it out. There was a time I went 2 years without any alcohol at all. And then I was like, I'm not going to say I'm never going to have it, but I'm just going to have it when I feel like it. And then I'd have like maybe like a little bit of half a glass with a steak or something, and I'd be able to tell, like, after a few sips, it would go from like a sweet, enjoyable feeling to like a bitter taste. And I'm like, okay, and that's enough.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then now I really don't have it all because I don't feel like it. There has been a time where I actually was working on a mine site and I consumed like, 10 ciders or something. And um, again, like the fallout that I had for probably 3 days from it, I was like, I didn't have any enhanced feeling of well-being in the moment. And I've just had deleterious effects for 3 days or more
Yeah.
afterwards. There is no ROI on this activity. And I'm not going to do this again. So pretty much now, yeah, I just don't drink. And
And I feel like this can be really a whole nother podcast topic.
oh,
But
for sure.
on the alcohol thing, just quickly, for me, when I actually looked at why did they drink, it tended to be more socially sort of acceptable, particularly in New Zealand. I assume Australian culture is very similar, like drinking's quite predominant. And then also confidence. And when I took the alcohol out, it was a real opportunity to go, oh wow, I feel quite self-conscious going and dancing
Yeah,
and
yeah,
like stretching that muscle. And now I almost feel like I don't need it for that crutch, and therefore, I don't have the same fallout the next day, which is wonderful. The brain injury still gives me its own kind of hangover in a sense.
yeah,
But now I'm confident enough to be that first person on the dance floor at the wedding. And it's not that security blanket that I had previously.
yeah, yeah. I noticed that. For me, I was always drinking for other people, but never because I
Yeah.
wanted to. It was like, oh, it's this person's party. I have to drink to be one of the, people that are showing up fully. And
Yeah.
what I started to do was I'd go to the bar and I'm like, oh, could you give me a short glass and put some brown cordial in it? And like, so I just would like make it look like I was drinking. And then when people have the perception that you're drinking, they don't care. If you say I'm having water, they're like, oh, such a letdown. When they think you're drinking, you can show up fully and yeah, they don't notice. But to your point as well, I did notice that what can happen is when you've got a drink in your hand, before the alcohol has actually affected you, you're like, oh, I now have permission to behave how I want because
Yeah.
if I do something that's unacceptable, oh, I was drinking, and it's this little scapegoat that can excuse your actions. But when you don't have that, you have to be fully responsible. So I think some people have this sense of contraction because they're like, oh, I don't want to express myself fully because this is so vulnerable.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because I definitely had that, but then also I feel like I'm slightly opposite. That I noticed this the last wedding I went to. Man, like my dad dance moves were like all out over the dance floor, like record terrible dance moves, but I was having so much fun. And the next morning, everyone was joking about them, and I just completely owned them. Whereas
Yeah,
when I used to drink, pull out those dance moves, the next morning I'd feel this real vulnerability hangover of like, oh my gosh, I looked so silly. So I think just the growth in confidence,
yeah,
that it's kind of me, and I'm like, it's what I want to do. It's all good. It's been
100%. And
cool.
yeah, definitely. I think to be able to do that, you've reached like, such a level of self-acceptance and certainty in who you are that, yeah, you don't need the validation of others and you can withstand any like, criticism without being sensitive to it.
Yeah. And it was interesting as well what you were saying around, initially in your journey, you try to make it look like you were drinking. Um, I laugh when I think about the first few events I went to where I wasn't drinking, where someone would go, you're not drinking. And I'd feel like I had to explain the whole, like, oh, I had multiple brain injuries, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah,
And then I got a little bit more comfortable, but other people would still be uncomfortable and there was still an element. Whereas now, if people come up to me, I'd just be like, oh, no, I don't drink. But this is what I'm having. And I think because I'm so relaxed about it and I'm still in and amongst, it makes other people more comfortable because it seemed
yeah,
to really be like quite a confronting thing for others that I wasn't drinking, which I find
yeah,
really interesting.
yeah, 100%. Because I think sometimes when you are doing something bold in a culture that isn't the norm, that it's a reflection of their choices. They're like, oh, she doesn't need to drink. Like, like subconsciously, of course, where it's like,
Yeah.
oh, like, am I now like, and that can sometimes lead to them be like, no, have a drink because they want to like bring you back into like their level where it's not then reflecting on their choices.
Yeah, totally. I think you've hit the hammer on the head. It's like bringing you back to their comfort level.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's like not a conscious thing, but I think that is a natural reaction people can have.
Yeah.
One other thing quickly, meditation was such a game changer for me. I found the book The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, and I was listening to it on repeat for like 3 months straight. I probably listened to it 50 times over during this period, like 14, 16 hours a day.
Wow.
And I was over in Bali just as this was beginning, so perfect place. And I started, pushing my level of vulnerability, like meditating in public while waiting for food rather than just trying to escape the present by going onto my phone.
Cool.
And as I included a bit of yoga in there as well, I think my mind has a tendency to be so overactive that can drain quite a lot of energy from me. And to be able to get to a point where the more you watch your mind through meditation, you can slow the stream of thoughts and also create a more ordered structure to the thoughts rather than them like firing out, with 10 thoughts a minute. You can have one thought come up that you can deeply dive into and explore. And it seems to be the more that you are present within your mind, the higher the quality of thoughts. For me, I've found when I'm not watching my mind, my thoughts tend to gravitate towards things of not necessarily like typical drama gossip, but entertainment. Oh, what's this TV show? Keeping up with this narrative that's going on in YouTube or media. And then as I watch my thoughts more, I've noticed like I'll start to have sparks of creativity for content creation, for business. And I literally found one day I sat there meditating for about 3 hours. And as I sat there, each thought became higher in quality, almost enticing, like the ego throwing up thoughts to get me to go act on it. Like, oh, that's $1,000 idea. Oh, that's a $10,000 idea. Oh, that's $1 million idea. And at some point I'm like, I've got to go write this down. Like,
That's epic. That's
yeah,
epic. I think breathing and meditation is like the most important first step, purely for what you
yeah,
spoke about around like settling the mind and then being able to step through from a place where you're much more grounded, much more conscientious, and much more sort of intentional about what you're doing, which is important for everything. But particularly brain injury recovery, and it's often the first thing I'll focus on when it comes to coaching clients that are navigating their brain injury journey, is that breathing and meditation. Because if I'm bringing my hands up like everyone can see. Anyway,
no, I can
if
see
our
that.
emotions are really, really, really high, if you think of a seesaw, you've got emotions on one end and rational thought on the other.
Mm,
If emotions are high, our rational thought can only be low. So meditation enables us to sort of even that equilibrium a little bit more
mm,
and then step out of the overwhelm.
yeah.
And also sort of step out of that fight or flight mode, which is just, it really is like the foundation to everything we do. Hey.
I'll share with you one last theory, keeping an eye on
Yeah.
time. It seems to me as well, the less when you're not meditating, your awareness is going to the outer of your body. And you could probably think of that linked to the sympathetic activation. So it's coming to, the superficial blood flow to the extremities, stress, and your awareness is on the outside. And the more you meditate, you're going into parasympathetic blood flow to the organs, but also you're inhabiting both the inner energy body and the mind. So instead of being out of your mind, you're getting into your mind. And that's when you can be more fully present as your true self, in my
Definitely.
experience. Just
Beautifully
throw a
worded.
little metaphysical slant onto it.
Yeah, I love it. That's so cool.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad we got to have this chat finally. This was,
Mm.
yeah, really good jam.
Yeah, thank you. No, you and me both. And just so much gratitude for you. I really hold appreciation for how deeply you do dive into things. And you just have such an energy that you bring to everything you do. So thank you for the
Thank you,
invitation because
Taya.
I've loved this.
Yeah, likewise. Definitely. Well, have an amazing day, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
Yeah, we'll chat soon. Enjoy.
All right. See ya.
See ya. Bye.
Well, there you go, guys. That was Taya, the empowerment coach, your brain BFF. So you can find her on Instagram, and I'll put that link up right now on the screen. And yeah, she is quite an inspiration. I've really great energy, loved hearing her story. And I think there'll be a lot of value to have from connecting with her, especially if you've found any concussion that you've had in the past that's affecting your cognition, and yeah, just some of the things we jammed on there. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast as much as I did, and yeah, look forward to sharing it with you. Ciao.